Well, thank you, Harley. I just wanted to say, he mentioned my credentials as an archaeologist. I should add for the topic this morning that I have a PhD in Middle Eastern Studies. We studied and went to school in Jerusalem. I also taught at the Hebrew University and have written a number of books on this topic. So if you're wondering who is he to be speaking about these things, I just want you to know I do have some background in that. But originally, I was coming to speak on another topic, and then October 7th happened. And because of that, I asked if I could change the message topics to deal with something that's very contemporary and very important to all of us. We have a lot of questions about what is going on and why, and so that's what I wanted to address this morning. So we're dealing with Israel at war, and part one will be this morning. Part two will follow in the service after. And usually this church is very solid on preaching the Bible. This deals more with some of the topics which also are in the Bible, but at the end of the last service, I'll deal with an application from Bible prophecy and also how that should apply to our lives. So if you hang in there for the second service, you'll get some of that as well. Let me just say before we begin, I have a book on the book table. There's only about 3 of them left, but it's called What Should We Think About Israel? A lot of the questions that people ask are answered in this book. I brought in 20 different leading scholars from Israel, Europe, all over to write in this, some who have spoken here, like Arnold Fruchtenbaum and many others. And we address these topics which are so important. And then new this morning is the Evangelical Study Bible. I was part of a team putting this together through our divinity school at Liberty University. I know Ed Heinzen had come here in years past to speak, and this was the last thing he edited just a week before he went to be with the Lord. This was finished. It's unique in that it deals with special creation, young earth. It focuses on a dispensational perspective throughout, and it's archaeological and messianic. I did 100 of the archaeological study notes. I did the book of Judges and 1st and 2nd Samuel and Ezra, Nehemiah, and Ezekiel in this. So there's a lot of good material. It's a New King James, large print. Some of you have problems with that. That's all there in a full color. Now, yesterday, and probably continuing today in Washington, D.C., we see over 100,000 Palestinian protesters yelling, Allahu Akbar. Great is Allah, there near the White House, protesting. Something we've never seen in the history of this country, and it needs explanation. Now, the catalyst for all this was what happened on October 7th. This was a day which has been called by Jews the worst since the Holocaust. In fact, more Jews were murdered on this day than in all of any day, even during the Holocaust. So you think about it, here are the statistics. 1,400 Israelis murdered, 5,500 wounded, 242 kidnapped and still held hostage, 9,000 plus missiles sent against Israel, and we have a global anti-Semitism. No wonder they call this Israel's Pearl Harbor or Israel's 9/11. And so they declared war as a result. It's not just another skirmish. In fact, for those who are interested, there was a ceasefire in place when Hamas came and did this. So people calling for ceasefire now need to remember what we did on 9/11 and what we did on Pearl Harbor. No one called for ceasefire. They said, go get them, okay? We're going to end this. They attacked us. That's the same thing we should apply to others. But across the world, here's a 1.5 million anti-Israeli march in Istanbul, Turkey. This isn't just local, it's around the world. We have to try to understand it. It may help if we remember 9/11. Most of us who do this were there, remember where we were on that day. We say 9/11, never forget. Now, as I said, this is Israel's 9/11 in spades. Okay, I mean, by comparison, yes, 1,400 people killed, but statistically in terms of the size of their population, 50,000 if you compare with us in one day. And on that day, you may not remember it, I recorded this because it came on the television that day, only briefly, but Palestinians celebrating the attack on the United States. Yes, Palestinians in the West Bank, but also Palestinians in New Jersey, right nearby. Both America and others. This was celebrated. You have to ask why people who were brought in in an immigrant status, but made part of the citizens of this country, would, on an instance like that, celebrate and pass out candy. Well, that's what the Israelis are asking this morning. We brought people in terms of Gaza. We gave them autonomy. They had self-rule. We did everything that we knew to do as a democratic, humanitarian-based country, and this is what we get around the world. Now, let me just say what I want to do from this message is have three things that are purposes for you. One, so you can pray properly. If you don't know what's going on, you won't be able to pray about it correctly and properly. Second, there are people talking about this everywhere. And you won't be able to engage with this culture intelligently if you don't have the facts. And third, to live faithfully. Because if you don't understand what's going on, how this fits into God's plan, you'll be really concerned. I mean, you'll be worried. You'll be glued to the television. All you'll do is be depressed. So we need to know what God's saying about this as well. This is a spiritual warfare for all of us. We're in the middle of it. And we should fight the good fight of faith. So looking at Israel at war, you first want to ask the question, why the war with Israel and why now? That's what we're going to take this time to deal with. I need to start a little bit with a crash course in the Middle East conflict. Now, I had prepared a bunch of slides for this. It was going to be great, but I said, that'll take the whole time. So I'm going to abbreviate this. What you see is these signs. Zionism is racism. Zionist criminals are producing a Palestinian Holocaust. What is this term Zionist? Well, just in a simple way, Zion is another term for Israel. It is because Zion is a name for Jerusalem, and by extension for everything. This is where God's promises were. You know, God's Mount Zion is holy. This is where God dwells. This is where the promises for the future come from. And so Zion is the promised home of the Jewish people, and anyone who believes that, who recognizes that Zion is the promised home of the Jewish people, is a Zionist. It doesn't matter whether you're Jewish or Gentile, okay? Muslim or Christian. If you understand that and recognize that, then you're a Zionist. And that's what they are talking about, railing against. Here's another sign I saw just this morning. My grandmother's older than your state, meaning that Israel has been around 75 years, and that's it. It's just a Johnny-come-lately, had no pre-existence. In fact, you'll hear people say that Palestine is our ancestral land, and it's been stolen from us. You'll see things like this, okay? You usually see this progression of pictures of the outline of a state. They will call it Palestine, others will call it Israel. And it looks like, as you look at this, that you see these white dots, that's the Jewish settlements, and then the rest must be the other people, just filling the whole thing. And then as you go through the years, you'll see how the white dot gets bigger and the green gets smaller. So the obvious message is the Jews came in, supplanted, and stole the land of the Palestinians, and there was nothing left. And that's why they say from the river to the sea, the river being the Jordan River there on that right-hand side of your screen, and the sea being the Mediterranean Sea on the other side. Everything in between is where the people live. And if you get rid of one people group, okay, in that, you have basically annihilated them. And yet they preach genocide. The Zionists are preaching genocide, and yet they are calling for this. You've never, ever heard that from the Israeli side. But this kind of map is touted throughout the Palestinian area, saying the Jews stole our land. The myth of coexistence in Israel, that's the New York Times putting that in their paper. And so I just want to mention that for a minute, because this is knowledge ripped out of context. When you look at this, and this is the only one we'll have time to look at, but this map intentionally misrepresents the facts on the ground, the facts of history. For instance, they show people, the white dots, and that's true, those are people. But the green are not people. That's uninhabitable land. That's the Negev. There's no, and when we talk about this, you could read Mark Twain's Innocents Abroad when he went over in the 1860s. He said, you don't see a single soul for 10 miles in any direction when you travel. It was a desolate land at this time. This was land just coming out from under the Ottoman Empire. There were no people like that there. So that's a misrepresentation. And there was no collective ownership of land at this time. So there were, of course, no Palestinians because there was no Palestinian people or language or state. None of that existed at all. And there was a place, as I say, called Palestine, but no separate Palestinian people. So let me just give you a little summary of facts that you may not have heard, just to put this in perspective. We can argue about it later, but this is what I want to bring out. First, before 1948, the Jews were the Palestinians. That's what they were called when Arabs, and they were not called Palestinians, they were called Arabs of different nationalities. When the Arabs were given that term, they said, don't call us that. That refers to the Jews. Because Palestine was the name given to Israel by Hadrian in the 2nd century AD as a punishment against the Jewish people. And it comes from the term Philistine, all right, which were the enemies of Israel, so they were using that to basically punish and degrade Israel in that way. In the Roman sources, is a classical term used for it. But you'll never find that term in the Bible. It's not referred to. In 1948, Israel became a state. And when that happened, Arabs in Israel became Israeli Arabs, and those outside of Israel eventually identified politically as Palestinians. So you also had Israeli Arabs living within Israel. But Palestinians identified politically in 1964 through the Palestine Liberation Organization, then in 67 when there was a war launch. But even in every UN document, everything we have dealing with the outcomes of those wars, 67, 73, Palestinians are not mentioned anywhere. So it was not a war with Palestinians, and it was not recognized as Palestinian land. From 1948 to 1967, Gaza was under Egypt. They had conquered it in 67, and the West Bank was under Jordan, and the Golan Heights were under Syria. None of this was under Israeli control. Nothing was stolen from anybody. And since 2005, Gaza has been autonomous. Under Ariel Sharon, they withdrew the protective or governmental aspect of Gaza, coming out of the 67 war that had been there, and they put it under the control of the Palestinians. The next year, the Palestinians had a national election, a so-called democratic election, and they elected Hamas as their official government representation. And they have been in charge ever since. That year and the following year, they drove out all of the, what we consider more moderate Palestinians, that is Fatah, the group that came under Yasser Arafat. And they went running off. They were being thrown off bridges and out of buildings, and they ran for their lives. I was in Israel when it happened. I saw it on the television. And they ran and took up refuge in Ramallah. And that's who, when you hear about a peace process, the peace process has always been with Fatah, who is not the official representative of the Palestinian people, but the official representative of the Palestinian people is a terrorist organization which we can't negotiate with. And so that's where we've been. There's never been a Palestinian people, language, culture, or state in the land of Israel, and it was never Palestinian ancestral land. That is simply a fact of history if you want to look at it. We've had a revisionist history. We have a very there is an emotional politics that is going on today where people side with what they consider the underdog, and they're buying into a rhetoric, but this is the facts. And then Jews never left their ancestral land. They have maintained a continual residence in Israel the last 3,500 years. It's not a case where the Jews were all driven out. In places like Jerusalem and Tiberias and Hebron and others, there's always been a Jewish community, always. And you can see throughout history different dialogues with the Jews in diaspora, those outside the land, with those inside the land. We have this whole record of correspondence has been published. So all the generations, this back and forth is there. And they did that despite whoever was in control of the land, okay, for the most part Romans, and then after the Romans, Muslims, and then the Turkish Empire for 400 years, and then the British. But there was always a Jewish presence there, even under an oppressive situation. So this is what we know. If you want more facts on this, two of the books I wrote, one called Unholy War. It came out after 9/11. All the facts are still the same, but the focus was on 9/11 at that time. And then I have a book called Fast Facts of the Middle East Conflict. It needs to be updated. I got to be working on that, but those are two books which will answer a lot of these questions that I can't right now. So, theories as to why the war now. Here's what you've been hearing. Resistance to Israel's ongoing occupation of Gaza and Palestine. Okay, and then to thwart Israel's attempt to normalize relations with Saudi Arabia. That was in the works, and so maybe this was done to keep that from happening. And then a result of U.S. appeasement of Iranian policies. We had that in the works. Now, all these could be part of, a result, but not the cause. So what is the real cause of this war? And to get to that, I have to do something that no one in the media has really been willing to do, and that's talk about the elephant in the room. So what is the elephant in the room? What is the real cause of all this? Well, it is religion. We're not supposed to talk about religion, but we're in church. We can talk about it here. Religion is something people don't talk about. It's supposedly used by uneducated people as a weapon to divide as opposed to connect people with each other. But as Charles Colson said, many people are trying to remove religion from public life under the banner of pluralism and cultural and political things. We have pluralism, multiculturalism, all this. But we can't take God out of the public arena. Everything ultimately comes down to what do you believe. Your actions are a result of what you believe. We come to Hamas, and we'll focus on Hamas because this is the perpetrator of the current situation. Hamas has in their own charter, it would be like our Constitution. This is what they live by. It says it is necessary to instill in the minds of the Muslim generations that the Palestinian problem, what we're talking about, is a religious problem. It's not political, it's not national, it's religious. And they say it should be dealt with on that basis, and that's why they're dealing the way they are. And so they make the statement again, here's the Supreme Islamic Research Council, not them, but expanding on that to a general Islamic statement. The Palestine question is not a national issue or political issue, but that's the way we deal with it as a country. We try to negotiate a political solution. We try to deal with a national, create two states, that'll solve the problem. But it says it's first and foremost an Islamic question. But nobody wants to go there, do they? Because that gets into religion. And the question is, somebody's right and somebody's wrong. And we want to have everybody right. But of course, they contradict each other, so they can't all be right, can they? They could all be wrong and one be right. And that is where we're going. But the Hamas covenant said the day of judgment will not come about until Muslims fight the Jews, killing the Jews. Jihad, which is holy war, becomes an individual duty of every Muslim. So when we talk about this solution, Hamas does not want a two-state solution. They never have. They say they do not want it. They want a final solution. And that echoes the language of the Holocaust and the Nazi regime who proposed this for the Jews. When you say Palestine will be free from the river to the sea, that's exactly what you're calling for. You're calling for the elimination of every Jewish person in this land or subjugated to Islam as dhimmi, second-class citizens under Islamic rule. Now, as I said, all religions cannot be correct because they contradict one another. So what do? Well, world views depend on word views. We have the Bible. They have the Quran. Their view of the Bible is it's just a bunch of nonsense that was changed and thwarted, and basically it's comes from the descendants of the Satans. It says they fabricated a Jewish history book full of promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He will give them the land of Palestine. Okay, which of course the Bible says give them the land of Israel, not Palestine. But nevertheless, they say your Bible, my Bible, is corrupt and worthless, means nothing, has no historical facts or truth. So we can start there. Now, Just looking at what Islam is not a religion such as Christianity or Judaism or Buddhism or Sikhism or Hinduism or any of the isms. It's not merely a spiritual belief. It's a complete way of life, having its own unique ruling and social and economic and judicial systems and foreign policy. Everything is subsumed under this religious idea of Islam. And that's why people they're born into Islam, so they are Muslims from birth, and they simply obey, and if they get out of line, they're punished. If they renounce Islam or leave Islam, they can be killed. There's no really getting out of this in that sense, because it controls everything in life. Edward Locke, who was a dean professor of leadership and motivation at the University of Maryland, said, "The Arab world rejects the whole concept of rights. Virtually every Arab country is a monarchy, theocracy, or military dictatorship. Freedom of speech, property rights, free elections, the separation of church and state are almost non-existent. Speaking out against the rulers or against the Muslim religion leads to imprisonment or death. All attempts to start competing political parties are ruthlessly crushed." This is what we're dealing with, okay? And I want this to be in your mind because Westerners don't think like those in the Middle East. We have a different worldview, we have a different mindset. You know, we all want freedom, we all love life. Not so. And I'll show you that's a part of our problem. But for instance, when they say Israel is the enemy of Allah, not the enemy of Palestine or enemy of Arabs, it's the enemy of Allah. It's a religious war. Now, I won't read all of this, but Wahhabi Islam is what's behind this. In the 18th century, you had Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab decide that Islam had become too, shall we say, quiet. It had become more civilized. It was developing in scientific areas and cultural areas. No, no, no. Islam didn't exist for that. Revolutionary Islam, to take the sword, to conquer was the idea. So he came in with the idea that we have to revive Islam back to that golden age of conquest. And that's exactly what he did. And he had supporting him Muhammad ibn Saud, who was the local ruler of Daria, which was just north of Riyadh. This is why the Saudis today are the protectors and the promoters of Wahhabi Islam. So who is Wahhabi Islam? Well, ISIS is Wahhabi Islam. And Osama bin Laden and the Taliban were Wahhabi Islam. And so are Sunni Muslims, which are like 90% of Muslims in the world. But some Shias are too, in one sense, embracing some of these ideas politically. So it's a death cult. It has spearheaded the violent revolutionary overthrow of Islamic countries such as Afghanistan and on and on. The Sharia law, a law that only regards Muslim faithful, okay, the Ummah, the whole of the Muslim world. You don't, if you're a Christian or a Jew, the Quran says, make no friends of Christians or Jews, for they're friends of each other. Now that sounds strange because, you know, throughout history we've been anything but that. But we all hold to the same book, and we have the same basic outline, and that's why we tend to support one another. And they understand that. But Sharia law puts everyone under a very strict type of law where you cannot build your house higher than a Muslim house. You can't have your grave, has to be lower so you can be walked on. You have no rights in court, and on it goes. Now, why now? Why the war now? Well, there are symbolic dates in Islam. There always has been. 9/11, that was on the anniversary of when Saladin conquered the Crusaders at the Horns of Hattin and put Jerusalem back under Muslim control. So these dates are important. For this date, October 7th, 50th anniversary of the last surprise attack on Israel, the Yom Kippur War in 73, or the 45th anniversary of the Palestinian assassination of Anwar Sadat for making peace with Israel in 81, or the 30th anniversary of the Palestinian attack on an Italian cruise ship where they threw Jews who were in wheelchairs over the sides of the boat, or the 22nd anniversary of the US-led attack on Afghanistan, which began in 2001, or the 26th anniversary of the US designation of Hamas as a terror organization after it attacked Israel. Okay, these are all important dates in their minds. Okay, they're still fighting the Crusaders. That's the West. And Israel is part of that because it is a democracy, which is something birthed from the West. This is going across the board, though. You can now see a wider regional war developing. The leader of Lebanon's Hezbollah. Hezbollah is supported by Iran, some by North Korea, but Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, Hamas, all of these are Iranian proxies. They've been meeting together, discussing how they can have a unified front. And now the West Bank, the Fatah, what we call moderate Muslims, are there. Mahmoud Abbas is the head of that. They have, for instance, said a number of things, but they are Wahhabi Islam, and as Ibn Warq, who was author of Why I'm Not a Muslim Anymore, he said there may be moderate Muslims, but Islam itself is not moderate. There's no difference between Islam and Islamic fundamentalism. At the most, there is a difference of degree, but not kind. All right, so they're the same down the line. So when you look at someone like Mahmoud Abbas, who's the head of the Palestinians in the West Bank, he was co-founder with Yasser Arafat. He claimed responsibility for the suicide bombings and terrorist attacks. He financed, or at least wrote the paychecks for the Palestinian terrorists who murdered the 11th Israeli athletes at the Munich Olympics back when. He earned his doctorate from the University of Moscow with a dissertation arguing the Holocaust was an invention of the Jews to gain international sympathy for the creation of the Jewish state. And he has campaigned alongside Islamic Jihad and Hamas terrorists, calling them heroes and Israel's Zionist enemy. And you can see this is in the West Bank. You have militancy surging up as a third front. Israeli security service arrests over 60 suspects in the West Bank. They're all in there being harbored. And the Palestinian television from Gaza praised Hamas terror massacre in Israel and called all hostages settlers. So this kind of thing. So what is the American response to that? Well, today, Secretary Blinken is meeting with the only moderates we can deal with as the next stage. What happens after all of this? We still have to have this two-state solution, right? We have to have Palestinians in charge, right? Who is it going to be? And so that's who it's going to be. All right. But we're still not at the real cause of this war. So look at these emblems. You see a Hamas or a Palestinian flag, and you see in the center of it the Dome of the Rock from Jerusalem. Now, why is that? This translates, by the way, Palestine is all about Jerusalem. So why are they advertising that? Well, if you look at what happened on October 7th, here is what Hamas said about itself. It hailed the victory in battle, attacking the settlements, as a victory in the battle for Jerusalem. And it said, we've achieved victory for the Battle of Jerusalem, the defense of Jerusalem. Hanaya, who is the head of this, Ismail Hanaya, he said, Jerusalem is the axis of the conflict. Now, have you heard that anywhere in the news? No one's saying that, but they're saying that. So if we take them at their word, what is this all about? Here you have it, like the Times of Israel mentioned it, because Hamas calls this the Al-Aqsa flood. What does that mean, Al-Aqsa flood? Well, Al-Aqsa is the name for the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Operation Al-Aqsa Deluge. This is in retaliation for Israel's desecration of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, or the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. He asked Palestinians living in East Jerusalem to join the forces, expel the occupiers, demolish the walls. Here is Hamas representative. The Al-Aqsa flood is just the first time. There will be a second and a third and a fourth. And he goes on, so they're calling it Al-Aqsa flood. Why is Jerusalem and the mosque there so important in Gaza? What does that have to do with the violence in Israel? Well, if you look at Hamas's emblem, you see first the Palestinian state, which is all of the map, and you see the typical Islamic slogan, there's no God but Allah, Muhammad is prophet. In the center, though, you see the Dome of the Rock with crossed swords, which means a symbol of jihad, okay, to liberate these places. You can see this having been built. This is from back in 2022. Hamas was threatening violence over Jewish visits to the Temple Mount. Jews were not allowed, but they went to pray there. That has been something the Muslims did not want them to do. But under 67, the status quo arrangement, they were supposed to be able to do that, but they wouldn't let them do that. So now they're doing that. And as Hamas co-founder Mohammed al-Zahar said, Jewish prayers are a blatant attack on the religious and Islamic status of the city. Okay, it has the possibility of dragging the entire region into an open religious war. Here in 23, coming up, this was just in August, it says the occupation authorities, that is the Israelis, are attempting to execute the extremist settlers' plan to put their hands on the blessed Al-Aqsa Mosque, to build the alleged temple. He warned against the consequences of this aggression and against the outbreak of a fierce religious war. Okay, and have you heard anything about rebuilding the temple? That's a religious thing. Okay, the idea of, this is what they're talking about. Half of the Jewish Israelis, the secular state, backs prayer on the Temple Mount. How can someone say, in our capital city, which we've had for 3,000 years, which is under the sovereignty of the state of Israel, that our own Jewish people can't go to the holiest spot for them and just pray? And so that's an affront to Israel's sovereignty, and this is being embraced by more than just the religious today. We have Jews occupying and controlling Jerusalem, but Gentiles occupying and controlling the Temple Mount. Where have you heard something like that? Well, we'll get to that in a minute. Here, for instance, is the Western Wall. That is a wall, but the Temple Mount is above it. You can see the Dome of the Rock peeking out just at the top of that picture. Here is Islamic prayer above, right at the Dome of the Rock. Of course, they're all facing away from the Dome of the Rock because they face toward Mecca, not toward the temple, as do the Jewish people. So what we see in Luke, it says, Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles is fulfilled. Arabs are Gentiles. Despite Israeli sovereignty over Jerusalem, Israel does not actually control East Jerusalem or the Temple Mount. Okay? So 64% of the city is still disputed, and the Temple Mount is not under their direct control, not archaeologically, not politically, not anything. So, you see signs like this. Al-Quds belongs to the Muslims. And of course, also, they don't like the U.S. Embassy. Because of this, what we deal with is a situation. UNESCO from the United Nations, always siding with the wrong folks, said that the Jews have no connection to the Temple Mount. They denied Israeli history. They wrote the Jews out of Temple Mount's history. They backed the notion of nullifying Jewish ties to the Temple Mount. And that left all these contested sites within Judaism and Islam. The result being you've had 500,000 Israelis stand and swear to support Jerusalem and the Temple Mount. But on the other side, you've had Islam, and particularly Hamas. This is a Hamas poster showing with this imagination in their mind that somehow there's barbed wire around the Dome of the Rock, and the devil, both the United States, the great Satan, and Israel, the little Satan, are there preventing Muslims who want to come from Mecca. Here you see them at the Kaaba coming. There's no such thing. There have been no pilgrims coming from Arab lands to the Dome of the Rock, even though they could. They don't come. What is that? This is all a fiction, but this is what people see. And so the Temple Mount is the most volatile 36 acres on earth. And as you know, and as we'll say in the next session, the Temple Mount is the focus of prophecy as well. This is where things will be wrapped up. This is where Christ will return. This is where his kingdom will be the capital of that. So much that's going on here. Well, back to what's happening. You see people here, some signs, hands off Al-Aqsa, or this one, hands off Jerusalem, okay? Or here's another one. You can see the Al-Aqsa with like being liberated. This is in Turkey. They get it more than those in the United States do. For instance, the Turkish dictator says each day Jerusalem's under occupation is an insult to us. He wanted to raise Islamic army to attack Israel simultaneously from multiple fronts. He has an obsession to take Jerusalem. He calls on Muslims to protect Al-Aqsa. Here's the Iranians. Iranians called the Zionist regime a cancer to be eradicated, called upon all the resistance forces throughout the region to do this. They put out a film showing the Iranian army attacking Jerusalem. Okay, very interesting, isn't it? Okay, so this is a holy war. It is jihad. It's an offensive war, not a defensive war. So I want to make that kind of clear. Now, I want to answer the question, how do we understand the horrific brutality by Hamas? This will conclude this morning, but you've heard about it. I'm not going to, for the sake of younger people hearing things, go through all the atrocities. They're unimaginable. We call them inhuman. We call them animals. All these type of things. So we ponder, how could people do this to other people? On what level could that even be done? And so, I'll just say here's one report as they interrogated one of the terrorists. He said, "We heard children inside and we shot till we didn't hear a sound." Or on and on, okay? Really, really terrible things. Now and they videoed this. They had GoPros on their head and they videoed everything that they did because they're martyrs and they want to get the claim of their own people. As Ron Dermer said, Hamas is not a terrorist organization, it's a genocidal organization. One IDF general said it's not a war, it's not a battlefield, it's a massacre. Netanyahu said Hamas is ISIS and must be treated that way. And indeed, I don't know if you saw this, but ISIS flags were left behind at some of the kibbutzim where these attacks happened. The guys had them in their backpacks, pulled them out, put them there. Here is Hamas leader, Ismail Haniyeh. He says, "We love death like our enemies love life. We love martyrdom in the way which Hamas leaders died. We are called a nation of martyrs. We are proud to sacrifice martyrs." Okay, it's a very different way of thinking than we think. And then you see in New York City, people carrying a sign that says, "Honor the martyrs of Palestine." So they don't think of them as brutal people. These people who did what they did to grandmothers and children and things went home and embraced their grandmothers and picked up their babies. So it's a religious mentality they've been taught since they were young. Here is part of it. So I picked up a lot of things off of the internet that are there. These are all films. You can see everybody saying these things. But in Islam, Allah turned the Jews into apes and pigs. They're not human beings, not genetically. They were changed. As the Quran says in 3 places, the divine punishment of Jews is mentioned. Allah cast aside his wrath, has fallen on those. He made some apes and swine. This is the end of those, be apes and despised. And throughout the Islamic world, this is all over the place, they're all called apes and pigs, which is why you behead them and you do other things, okay? In the Quran, it says, the unbelievers, you're to smite above their necks and smite off every finger of them. So the people who were left behind, so many were beheaded, so many had their hands and their limbs removed because it's a religious edict. It's part of a fatwa. There's these things that are commanded. Now this will alarm you a bit, but we have to understand it. One person said this kind of barbaric mutilation can only be done by a human being who is indoctrinated from a young age. You are brought up with this. This was a woman's television program aired in Saudi Arabia and Egypt. And here's what they said. They interviewed a 3.5-year-old real Muslim girl about the Jews. She was asked whether she liked Jews. She answered no. When she was asked, "Why don't you like them? They're apes and pigs." "Who said this?" the moderator asked. The girl answered, "Our God." "Where did he say this?" "In the Quran." At the end of the interview, the pleased moderator said, "No parents could wish for Allah to give a more believing girl than she. May Allah bless her and her mother and father. The next generation of children must be true Muslims. We must educate them now while they are children so they will be true Muslims." And this is what you see. Now, if that's not just an isolated website, I went ahead and made a list of all the other ones that are there that have all children's programs saying all of these things, okay? So, and then we have in Gaza, as well as other places too, these camps, okay? And they're education camps. After school, the kids go to these things and they're taught this. They're taught jihad, they're taught to spread it. It's a means of indoctrination to create martyrdom. You can see this all throughout. And listen to this. This was recorded. This was on one of the GoPros. And it's a conversation between a Hamas terrorist on October 7th and his father. The son was excited. Baba, Father, I killed 10 Jews with my own hand. See, on WhatsApp, I filmed everything. In the background, hear the Israelis pleading for their lives while telling his parents with pride. Okay? Imagine that. That's what they believe. All right? So all that's there. And we see it here. Here is, again, the spokesman. Does that mean the annihilation of Israel? Yes, of course. All right? And I want to drive that home. He says, this means just that. We will repeat October 7th attack again and again until Israel is annihilated. We are victims. Everything we do is justified. And strangely enough, you'd think that the press would get that, but no, here is a piece. MAGA and Christian nationalists, bigger threat to America than Hamas could ever be. That may be some of you, okay? How do you feel about that? I want to end with this. This is a girl from Gaza. There are Christians, there are evangelical Christians in Gaza, just like there are right now evangelical Christian Jews who are members of congregations, pastors, associate pastors, youth leaders, by the hundreds, literally, out on the field. I know of some on the front lines in Gaza who are fighting right now. So this affects the church worldwide. But she says, a Middle East that has no room for Jews is the Middle East that has no room for Christians or any other minority. And that'd be good for all the people carrying the freedom banners today and saying liberate, and you ask them, the gays are marching because they want to join a liberation organization, the blacks are marching in a liberation organization. Say, now wait a minute, what does it mean? Because they hang gays from cranes, they kill them, and also any other minority. So what are you thinking is going on? But we don't think. So in the next hour, I want to talk about what we should think and why we can analyze what's going on, particularly in the college campuses, why the students think the way they think. Let me just end with this. Netanyahu, in a psalm recited to the IDF troops, said, violence, and by the way, the word in Hebrew, Hamas, is violence. It's not what Hamas is an acronym that means something else, but it sounds like that. So he says, violence or Hamas will not be heard again in your land, nor devastation or destruction within your borders, but you will call your walls salvation and your gates praise. And I think it's good upon entering anything of this magnitude to at least enter with that scripture, that promises scripture in our mind. All right, let me just close in prayer with us. Father, thank you for this time thinking about some of the facts of history, some of the difficult things related to another religion, but it's a religion nonetheless that is not just in competition with our faith, but is trying to overcome and eradicate the things which are the promises of God and the place where God has promised to bless all the world, and through the people who he's promised to bless all the world. So because of that, Lord, these things are important to us. Help us, we pray, to understand. Help us to pray properly, to engage this culture. And Lord, especially not be afraid to put our faith wholly in you and the promises of your good word. And we thank you in Jesus, our coming Savior's name. Amen.